During the Second World War, the Allied armies needed large quantities of ammunition to fight. This ammunition was mostly produced in the U.S., from where it needed to be brought forward to the front. After being produced, this ammunition was boxed, delivered to a port, loaded upon a ship, and sailed across the ocean. Once at the port of destination, it was unloaded and delivered to the front line. Most of this loading and unloading was done by Black Americans. Curious why this matters? Watch today's episode of Militology to find out. Port Chicago is located on the shore of Sassoon Bay, which is connected to the San Francisco Bay. Construction started shortly after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and on 8 December 1942, the first ship was loaded from the location. At this place, small arms ammunition, as well as bombs, shells, naval mines, and torpedoes, were put on board of ships bound for the Pacific Theater of Operations. This lethal freight was delivered by rail to Port Chicago, and from there it was transported by crane, winch, or hand into the cargo ships, which would carry it across the ocean. Most of the men working there were Black Americans. Twice a lecture was given about the safety regulations, as well as some informal talks, but there had been no check to see if any of it was remembered. Initially, the men were afraid of explosions, but it was partially solved with grim humor. One of the men working there, Carl Tuggle, was dismayed about working at Port Chicago. Initially, he felt scared, but one fellow told Carl Tuggle, "You shouldn't have any fear. If something goes off here, you wouldn't know anything about it." The men were hesitant to work with explosives, but they were told that the ammunition was not active and could not explode. Thus, they handled it roughly, for example, rolling the ammunition along the wooden pier. Many of the men working there were of the lower-scoring GCT classes, which strained the relations between officers and enlisted men. The officers accused the men of being unreliable, emotional, and incapable of understanding or remembering instructions. Additionally, the Black enlisted men had a complicated relationship with the Black petty officers, who were seen by some workers as incompetent and unable to voice the concerns of the men to higher officers. In April 1944, Captain Merrill T. Kinney assumed command of Port Chicago. He received no training in loading ammunition. To make matters even worse, the loading officers pushed their men to load the cargo as quickly as possible. The junior officers betted against each other on their divisions, as the 100-man crews were called. It made for a recipe for disaster, which happened on 17 July 1944. On 13 July 1944, the Liberty ship SS E.A. Bryan docked at the Port Chicago pier. The ship was carrying 5,292 barrels of fuel oil for its trip across the Pacific Ocean. After 4 days of loading, the ship was filled with some 4,600 tons of explosives, making it about 40% full. On that fateful day, 98 men of Division 3 were loading the E.A. Bryan with incendiary 650-pound bombs each into the number 1 hold, and these bombs had the fuses installed, making them live. More ammo was loaded as well, such as 1,000-pound bombs into the number 3 hold, while fragmentation cluster bombs were loaded into hold number 4, and 40mm shells were loaded into the number 5 hold. Another ship, the SS Quinault Victory, was being prepared for loading. 102 men of the 6th Division were working on this. No ammunition was yet on board, but loading would begin at midnight. There were 67 crew members of the 2 ships. Several support personnel moved around as well. Between the 2 ships stood 16 rail cars with ammunition on 3 parallel tracks. They were supposed to be loaded on board of the ships over the next couple of days. In total, there were 2,000 short tons of TNT present on the pier and the ships. At 10:18 p.m., sound was heard, and shortly afterward, an explosion occurred on the pier, which started a fire. A few seconds later, another bigger explosion detonated almost all the ammunition. The E.A. Bryan was destroyed, and the Quinault Victory was torn to pieces and thrown in several different directions. The pier, including everything on it, was blasted to bits. Nearby rail cars were crumpled by the shock, and nearby buildings were destroyed. The explosion sent a shockwave through the earth. equivalent to an earthquake of 3.4 on the Richter scale. 320 people died instantly, of which 51 could be identified, and 390 were injured. 202 of the killed and 233 of the injured were Black Americans. There was nearly $9.9 million in damages. Carl Tuggle, who had finished working his day, was blown out of his bunk and onto the floor. Seaman First Class S.B. Scott, who was treated for blast injuries, recounted, "My buddy and I were talking. Suddenly an explosion tore down part of the barracks. It wrecked the administration building and the camp was wrecked. It happened all of a sudden. We were taken completely by surprise, and the next thing I knew, there were a lot of fellows lying around moaning and crying." Scott himself appeared dazed by the experience. No immediate cause for the explosion was identified. Several sailors, such as Divisions 1, 5, and 7, were soon assigned to distant stations. Divisions 4, 8, and parts of 2 were moved to another nearby location, Mare Island Navy Yard. On 30 July, memorial services would be held for the deceased, while also attempts were made to compensate the families of the victims. Initially, they would be granted $5,000 in compensation. However, a representative from Mississippi, John E. Rankin, objected to it because most of the people who benefited from it were Black. Instead, the compensation would be $3,000. The Divisions 2, 4, and 8 had moved to Mare Island Navy Yard. These men had previously been at the Port Chicago disaster and had been brought up to strength with new replacements. On 8 August 1944, the USS Shanghai docked there. When on 9 August, the 328 were assembled, and when ordered to march toward the ammunition loading dock, the group stopped and didn't continue. All stated that they were afraid and that they refused to work under the same working conditions as before. After the officers explained that it was their duty, 70 sailors went to work, while the remaining 258 were temporarily put on a barge. Although it was not intended for such, it was made to hold just 75 men. All were told to stay there under guard. The men on the brig had not been given a direct order. Instead, they were asked if they were going to load the ships or not. On 10 August, there had been a small conflict among the prisoners, and there had been a brief fight in the mess hall. Seaman First Class Joseph Joe Small was asked by officers to keep the prisoners on good behavior and assemble a team of reliable men to carry it out. On 11th August, the 258 men from the prison barge were marched to a nearby sports field and told by Admiral Carlton H. White that the fighting troops needed the ammunition and the refusing to work would be treated as mutinous conduct. In times of war, this could be punished with a death penalty. Although loading ammunition was dangerous, death by firing squad was guaranteed. The men were told to separate themselves into two groups, those who would obey all orders and those unwilling to obey all orders. Out of the 258, 44 refused to obey all orders and were taken to the brig. The remaining 214 were sent to the barracks. 6 of them, who failed to show up for work call the next day, were also taken to the brig. In total, there were now 50 mutineers. The 258 men were interviewed during August, and many things went wrong. Occasionally, the men were interviewed in the presence of an armed guard. Some men had statements that didn't reflect what they had said, and in a few cases, people were outright ordered to sign. 208 men were convicted of disobeying orders. The 50 men, or Port Chicago 50 as they were known, were charged with disobeying orders. It was a diverse group. There were 2 cooks who were physically unfit for loading ships. Another man had a broken wrist and had replied no when asked to load ammunition. The defense lawyer claimed that the men had not conspired to usurp, subvert, or override superior military authority. In the trial that followed, the prosecution, led by Lieutenant Commander James F. Coakley, tried to convince the jury that all the men had conspired to mutiny against their superior officers, while the defense denied that this was what was happening. On 24th October 1944, the court ruled that all 50 men were guilty of mutiny. The men were reduced in rank and sentenced to 50 years of hard labor, followed by dishonorable discharge. On 15 November, Wright reduced the sentences of some men. 24 were given 12 years in prison, 11 received 10-year sentences. The 5 youngest men received 8 years in prison. 10 men kept their 15-year sentences. Thurgood Marshall, working on behalf of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, started a campaign to appeal the sentences of the men. This included releasing a pamphlet which even reached Eleanor Roosevelt, which she sent to the Secretary of the Navy, James Forrestal, who recommended the court to reconvene and reconsider the sentences. The courts thereupon reaffirmed the reduced sentences. After the war with Japan was over, the sentences were drastically reduced. In September 1945, the sentences were shortened to a year, while Captain Harold Stassen recommended in October that 2 or 3 years, depending on the good conduct records of the men, were appropriate. On 6 January 1949, 47 of the 50 men were released. 2 of the remaining 3 were recovering from injuries, while the last one was not released due to bad conduct. The Port Chicago Naval Magazine National Memorial was dedicated in 1994 to the lives lost in the explosion. In December 1999, Freddie Meeks, one of the few of the group of 50 still alive, received a pardon from President Bill Clinton. However, the convictions have not yet been overturned. The Port Chicago disaster is the deadliest stateside disaster of World War II. However, the resulting blast waves starkly illuminated the segregation and racist practices in the Navy. Thank you for watching this episode. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to our channel for more content, and don't forget to hit the bell icon to be notified of our next drop into combat. Stay tuned.